in their desire to know where they are, who they are, what life is all about, and etc., that ordinary men are left to study second order, derivative, ancillary maps such as religion, rather than some direct or the direct original source. That's what we were mentioning last time. And to rekindle for a second your interest, they are further bedazzled, if not bamboozled, by life by being forced to debate the relative possibilities of the auxiliary maps, potential accuracy, which is nil. That is, of being driven to debate astrology's, the possible validity and reality of astrology, when in fact, if it were real, it's unnecessary. I just remind you, because we're getting into that, or I hope to. That sounds like real talk. I hope to cover that area later in a slightly altered manner. Not fixed, for those of you who are sitting with your legs crossed, altered. Those of you who've never worked for a veterinarian, check with your friends later. All right, all of that, and tied to two more aspects that we were mentioning. A, that an expert has got to be able, must be able to ignore the obvious, and B, that to truly know where you are, you must be creative. That is, you must be able to make it up. Now, having to do with creativity, originality, which rather than me start off with any sort of warning that we're going to be intending something in a slightly altered way than would ordinarily be done, we can just all go, hey, what else is new? And press on. But consider, for instance, in such things as hobbies, creative hobbies. Now, I'm going to try and draw your attention tied to the last things I was mentioning. Remember, A, that an expert out in the collective world, just in the ordinary or rational sense, an expert is one who can ignore, is one who must ignore the obvious, as insane as that may sound at first blush. Tied to B, which is to actually ever know where you are, to know anything pertinent to what is going on in life, one must make it up. That is, one must know how to be creative and original. And as a Kyroot pointed out last time, that an old man was telling a kid, in a way that is helpful, at least that creative and original, that's helpful, and yet not enough to be what? Dangerous. You know what I mean. Of course, the truly dumb always think, yeah, I know what everything means. And that's the great thing about being truly dumb, is you cannot hurt yourself any further than you are now. There's another Kyroot in there somewhere. The great things about being dense. Well, one is you're bulletproof, but let's go on. Well, even if you're not bulletproof, you do understand you can be shot, and if you're dumb enough, you don't know it. So, I wonder what that meant. Okay. Tied into those two, I was going to use creative interest and originality. Let's start off in just what would appear to be the ordinary sense of the word, because it is, as always, a decent reflection of something. Although derivative, second order, is the way it's used, as always. But let's say someone starts out, just a person starts out, and I'll assume almost all of you, just been around this for a length of time because there's a certain kind of genetic justice, but that everyone had at one time some sort of creative hobby, some sort of interest. And a man, a woman starts out at an early age. You sketch. You try to write. Try to be a poet, a novelist. You try to compose music. You try to play music. And then and people do it, although they don't call it this, but to point out, you do it because initially that kind of creativity feeds the nervous system's development. Now it does, regardless, and in some way ordinary people would agree to that. Of course it goes somewhere else. But it is literally what it's doing in a sense. That it is feeding, even if you're just a child and you just enjoy this, sometimes you got, if you're just sketching, just drawing pictures all the time, cartoons, it is feeding in a way that is somewhat out of the ordinary. Still within the confines, of course, of reality, local reality, but it is a form of a kind of direct feeding of one's nervous system development. Not motor skills, not that. We're talking about up here at this end. But then, one grows up. And then, one can, after one grows up, become like a, all in quotes, here we go, we all still have the quotation marks on our typewriters, thank God. But then one can grow up and one can become the, quote, artist, the professional artist as expert. In other words, it is no longer a hobby. It is no longer that childish hobby. So you can grow up, you can become an expert, even in the field that at one time was your creative hobby. And you can then, by growing up, you can miss out. That is, you can ignore the obvious. Which is, I thought you would never ask. In this case, what is the obvious? Now that you've grown up and it's no longer a hobby, the obvious is the nourishment that used to fuel has stopped. And now you can be an expert. Now I use that in the broadest sense. You don't have to be a recognized authority in some field on some worthwhile scale, but let us say that you went from sketching and now here you are grown up and you're teaching art at a college. That you are, in the sense, an expert now. But to be an expert, you have got to ignore the obvious. Now I picked this out for a very good reason, because I set up the premise for you that is based on actual fact that the so-called creative arts, creative hobbies, do in fact, in a way that is pertinent enough to talk about, they do in fact more directly feed the development of the nervous system. Let's say drawing, painting, trying to write down your thoughts, trying to be a poet just at an early age, in a very particular way, is more directly feeding the nervous system here than is trying to develop what they call motor skills. That is, out playing baseball. Not that there's anything wrong with it, but it is a different order of the development of the nervous system. That the days of glory of the lower places, the lower areas of the nervous system, they have already had their days of great success. Not that they still don't. But for you to look around at humanity, if you look at history as personified by being superimposed, what appears to be the present, for those of you that didn't get the one about the outbuilding there in that particular complex that had produced a time-materium, wherein they could, through some kind of magic, they could flash up, they could superimpose now, the present, on whatever time segment they wanted to. You're going to have to figure it out. It's kind of like a planetarium that they can have whatever time you want, but then they could flash up right now. Assuming you understand that, then do you see, although there's nothing whatsoever amiss, you know, it wouldn't need me to tell you if there was anyway, but there's nothing amiss with professional sports, amateur sports, but you do realize, do you not, that you're somewhat, shall we say, behind the times if you personally, individually, down into the deep sockets of your own nervous system, took it as a great proof of humanity's development over the fact that in this day and time, in 1991, last year, that, for instance, the Atlanta Braves baseball team could have a winning season. Now, if you look upon physical, you miss the point. People are running faster. People are jumping higher. You might be jumping higher. You might be able to lift more weights. The weightlifting team of America, of Albania, may be breaking their old records. Nothing wrong with it. But if you look upon that as being exemplary, if you look at that as being the paradigm of life's evolution, it's not that you're wrong. It's just that you're in the wrong time zone to be listening to this. Because that day of glory has already walked by. It went through the parade, and everyone threw the laurel leaves, and everyone applauded. They still do, you understand, because it's not gone. It's just a different time zone. And you're behind the times if you see that as being, well, hey, we're getting somewhere now because we can jump higher. Okay. But that is not where it's developing. Now back to where we were. That was the point I wanted you to see, that it's not, from an ordinary view, right or wrong. So for the collective, it's neither here nor there. But a kid's, an individual person's development initially is fed in a slightly different way if they're pursuing some, quote, creative hobby beyond the motor skills, beyond sports, which is all right, but you should go ahead and get that over with when you're 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, whatever years old. That's another time zone. You got to leave there. Or you're supposed to. Most everybody else stays there. At least if you stay there, you will never have to appeal to a local guide and complain about being overly excited, you remember, and him have to come around and diagnose the problem and say, well, there's your problem. A man your age is not supposed to have a nervous system that excited. So if you want to be non-excited, don't take a lesson from that kid that was standing in the door of the bus tonight that said to the driver, do you know exactly where you're going? And the driver said, well, certainly, my boy. And he said, I'm out of here. But if that's not what you want, is get on the bus. And of course, you're ordinary. You don't know it, but the question then is, or the comment is, hey, I had a choice. So we have the child, back this person we're talking about. A person pursues some creative hobby that in a sense that we're not going to debate and pick apart, that at some early age, they are indeed in some ways striving for originality. Let's say even attempting it, even succeeding in some little way that we won't debate to death. But what happens? Even if your interest survives enough that you end up pursuing that area as a profession, you become an instructor in painting and drawing. You are now an expert. To become an expert, you've got to miss out. You have got to be able to ignore the obvious. And the obvious is, I am now doing this, and what I used to get out of it, I don't get anymore. But hey, you can't be aware of that. If we did, forget about just the art schools closing. Church is gone, education's finished. Of course, there is some upside to it. All garages would be out of business, so that you wouldn't have to confront that Saturday problem. From a revolutionist vantage point, I'll put it to you this way, that the more you pursue ancillary sources, the less is the possibility of being original, of being creative. That is, in a way that defies any sort of finite logic, of course. But if you are pursuing, the more you pursue the ordinary, the sane, there's nothing wrong with them, but the more you're pursuing these derivative sources, such as if you start out, and let's take it a little more perhaps exotic mentally, instead of painting, playing music, let's say that your creativity seemed to come out as trying to be a thinker, even in an early age, that you tried to philosophize, you tried to read books on theology, you tried to go talk to ministers and rabbis, that you were seeking the secret of life, that old thing. And let us say that you end up in that area, that you pursue it. Let us say that you're now recognized, you're a world of a quiet, respected rabbi, a learned man of that kind of intelligence, that kind of knowledge. Or that you are, perhaps you go in another slightly different area, that the human condition interests you so much that you end up through med school and you become a psychiatrist, several books, a nice position, credentials. To reach that point, to become an expert, you have to be able to ignore the obvious. The obvious being that the thing that started you out wanting to be a priest, a rabbi, a psychiatrist, and the interest that you had, that let's say it was valid, I'm not questioning that you started out in early age reading psychology. And you thought, this is it. There was never any doubt. This is what I want to know about. I want to know what the hell humans are about. And you end up pursuing that. And it fed you. It was feeding your nervous system. It was nourishing you in a way that was singular to you. To become an expert, you got to grow up, you got to miss out, you got to be able to ignore the obvious, that is, that you finally get to be an expert, and the obvious is, this does not any longer at all feed and nourish me as it did. And of course you can't do that. You'd be nuts. You just can't do it. But the fact then is that from a revolutionist vantage point, the more you pursue the ancillary sources, the less possibility there is of being creative or original. Which I was the first to admit defies any reasonable finite logic, because an ordinary mind, if it would tolerate any of this and listen for a little while, would go, well, then what? Now, of course, I could say, hey, I ask you first. It just seems absolutely irrational. Doesn't begin to cover it, but I don't know what else to do except maybe say, damned irrational. How about that? To say you mean going a certain way, the harder you try, the further away you get. Of course, it's not that binarily simple, but that's about the extent that you can put it into words. I could start drawing out more exotic picturizations. But it is contained within, the way I just tried to put it to you, that the more you pursue the ancillary sources, the more you pursue maps, which is the only choice you have ordinarily, but the more you pursue the ancillary sources, the further you get from being creative or original. You could turn it into a revolutionist outlaw law. It is simply that relying on derivative sources suppresses creativity, which we wanted to really be, I started to say dirty, but it wouldn't be any dirtier nutso than ordinary, would it? Just stop there, because then you're left again. If you're just using street level thinking, you say, well, all right, whithereth I go from here, which I don't know why you talk like that. How would you make it the first person version of Quo Vadis? Where goeth I from here? Well, don't let those chariots run over your toes. Relying on the ancillary sources, and now, as you know by now, it has no disrespect, it's not even any particular interest, but all the ordinary, instead of me just saying ancillary sources, but all of the commonly known aspects, areas of life. Religion has always been the main one. Psychology, psychiatry, history, everything in the secondary intellectual world of man, that no matter what it appears to be at the surface, if questioned a little bit, if scratched a little bit, they will all admit, yes, I'm a pawnbroker. No, you got that wrong. If scratched just a little bit, they'll say, yes, no matter what we appear to be, the intent of this art or this science is to try and give men more information about who they are, what life is about. Okay, gotcha. Back to the outlaw law. Relying on derivative sources, which all of those are. And they would admit it, if I put it to it in a nice, non-pejorative or aggressive manner. All of the arts, all of the sciences would admit, yes, we are in some way a reflection. We are in some way a second order. We're one step removed. Physics won't say that they're the laws of the universe. Physics would say, no, we're attempting to interpret. We're attempting to extract. We're attempting to investigate and understand what they are, but we are not the laws. That's silly. They might say that, but that is not the way life operates at a finite level within a closed system. The mind takes the sources as being the reality of what they purport to talk about. All right? Your mind seems like reality. And if you're sane, of course, you'd go, well, sure, what are you, crazy? What are you insinuating? What's the alternative? And of course, to that kind of person, I'd have to go, well, I guess you caught me. Because you can't tell the ordinary mind that there's an alternative. Because the alternative, by its own definition, is what? Insanity. Because they're saying, wait a minute, you're saying that the ordinary perception of what's going on is wrong, so what's the alternative? I'm trying to get you to see there are the possibility of cracks here and there, or else none of this would make sense. And a fellow in the back says, you mean some of it does? Who let him in here? I'm sorry, that's my brother. In law. Relying on ancillary derivative sources, which is all the intellect is ordinarily driven by. You do follow that. I'll go back and give you the simple version I started, but I'm assuming that you're putting it together yourself. But relying on the ancillary sources suppresses creativity. It suppresses originality. In other words, sort of. If you attempted to study X, whatever it was, in life, the more you study X and the more you become an expert on X, and you can, of course, study it directly. If you wanted to figure out what's the spiritual meaning of life, I'll put words in somebody's mouth, then you would go study what? Religion or theology. Or if you wanted to find, if you took what seemed to be another approach, I want to know physically what's going on in life. I don't care anything about religion and all that crap. I want to know physically. It intrigues me, the stars moving around and shadows. You would what? Go study physics. All of these are derivative. It can't be otherwise. But the fact remains. I say it's a fact. I said it. And I got the microphone. All right. Relying on derivative sources suppresses creativity. An ordinary mind can make nothing of that. It could, in fact, grab it and turn it inside out, or turn it, at least give it a half Nelson and run off in another direction and say, well, that's absolutely wrong, because that's what creativity is. That's what scientific discoveries are. That's what new artistic expressions are. And at that level, they got you. That's true, because all you got to do is check your own mind. Your own mind goes, yeah. For a while there, for a second, you almost had me. I was sweating. But now I see, yeah, that's right. What? Well, what have you just said? All right. Sometimes I try and gauge how many people are still above the water line. Well, as you and I both know, it doesn't prove anything to, well, it was me or you doing it to yourself, to lose yourself or to drown yourself. Pondering. I was going to try and take a fairly large jump, which was no jump at all. An extreme apparent change of subject, still connected with this. But if that clock's right, how much trouble is it to fill in this much time? I just hate to.
None. A few minutes were added. It's fine.
Well, rather than take a bigger jump, which was not much of a jump, but it was going to sound like a huge jump, I think we'll stop if you can piece it all together. No offense to your brains. It's not you, it just, I know at times it begins to, almost going to cease trying to be original, say, strain one's credulity. But I don't want to say it because I never bothered to look up what that meant, and I never took home economics, so I'm not sure. I was never sure what a credulity was. Well, till next time.